Hello everyone, Professor Kristol here. So after talking to some of my students and hearing about their brief understanding of neoconservatism, introducing some of that discussion into the classroom, some figures like Bill Kristol, who they might know a little bit about, and then hearing students talk about Trump's Venezuela policy, I wanted to kind of make a video putting these ideas together and kind of putting them into context maybe for students that don't have a great understanding of what neoconservatism, Bill Kristol's ideologies, and how maybe pieces of Trump's foreign policy isn't quite as remote, isn't quite that different than some of these theories that were being used in the early 2000s. But of course, the Trump administration does have a policy of America first. So as we will see, and as we oftentimes see with American national security, it is not as simple as slogans would oftentimes have you understand. And maybe that's obvious. Like, of course, the real world is always more difficult and complicated than slogans. But foreign policy, national security absolutely shows the complexity of the world. So I want to explore this theme that's pretty important in foreign policy and how there is this persistence of ideas across different eras, and across different leaders. So specifically, we're going to look at the role of Bill Kristol, who's still around and still is quite popular. If you watch or listen to The Bulwark, Bill Kristol has a show on there. So his ideas, his influence in American foreign policy is absolutely still listened to by a lot of people, including maybe a lot of people who don't realize that Bill Kristol is a pretty seasoned foreign policy intellectual. And so maybe people that are newer to politics don't quite understand or know this background of Bill Kristol and his ideology of neoconservatism. And I want to connect that to Donald Trump's approach to Venezuela, something that's in the news. And when I talk to students, they've heard about it, even if they're not really paying attention. And so what is fascinating is that these two figures, who on the surface could not be more different. If you listen to The Bulwark, you will encounter Bill Kristol's criticisms of Trump and of the Trump administration. But Kristol and Trump's foreign policy actually do intersect in some ways when it comes to how they think about America's role abroad. So let's start with Bill Kristol. Kristol is oftentimes described as one of the key architects of modern neoconservatism. So when I'm teaching students about international relations and trade and America's role in the world, most students have heard about neoconservatism, even if they haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about it. So Bill Kristol founded the Weekly Standard in the mid-1990s, and for years really used the magazine as a platform to advance his ideas and to put out his thoughts on American foreign policy. So he is not just a commentator, though. He is also an agenda setter, shaping how conservatives thought about foreign policy in the post-Cold War world. So what does Bill Kristol actually believe? His core conviction is and was that the United States, as the world's sole superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union, both had the ability and the responsibility to use its power abroad to promote democracy and secure American interests. Neoconservatism, as he articulated it, wasn't shy or cautious about using American force in the world. So, Kristol's ideas argued that America should confront authoritarian regimes, should support democratic movements, and not hesitate to project force if necessary. So, underlying this was a very specific vision of security. For Kristol and those like Kristol, American security wasn't just about defending the homeland from direct attack. It was also about shaping the international environment in which threats might emerge. So, in other words, you don't just wait for danger to come to the homeland. You go into the world and try to structure in a way that minimizes the chances of that danger in the first place. So, that meant, what did that mean in practice? That meant that promoting democracy was important. That meant that promoting democracy, because democracies, the argument went, are less likely to start wars, something you'll hear about and learn about in international relations courses. Democracy, the democratic peace theory, that democracies don't go to war with one another. So democracies are less likely to go to war, they are less likely to support terrorism, and they are more likely to be America's friend. It also meant that confronting dictators and rogue states was important, because if you leave them alone, in Kristol's view and in many neoconservatives' views, that gave these autocrats, these dictatorships, time and space to grow into bigger threats. So they might be a minor threat today, but if you don't engage them today, they will grow into larger threats. So neoconservatism believed in the power of American leadership. If you read Bill Kristol's works, you will encounter a lot about America's leadership and how America can play a role in the world. And it's kind of America's duty to play a role in the world. That America leadership is important. That America's leadership has a moral good. It is a moral good and a strategic necessity. So in the early 2000s, after the attacks of September 11th, Kristol and many other neoconservatives had a pretty powerful moment of influence. Their ideas shape what became known, or what we think about now, as the Bush Doctrine, the Bush administration's foreign policy ideology. So what we call the Bush Doctrine today. So we won't spend time. I made a video in the past thinking about the Bush Doctrine, but the main takeaways from that is the doctrine. And the doctrine incorporated three elements that came right out of the neoconservative playbook: preemptation, unilateralism, and democracy promotion. So that you do it in advance, you might have to do it alone, and democracy promotion. So it justified the invasion of Iraq and a much more sort of American role in the world. I apologize. Maze is hanging out beside me. My husky is sitting here and looking out the window and just saying hi. So when we think about the neoconservatism, the important point for this video is that neoconservatism did not end with the Bush administration. So even as the Iraq War became unpopular by the American public, and even as Kristol himself became a controversial figure, when you watch The Bulwark and Kristol talks about foreign policy, and then you look at the comments section, people are pretty critical of Bill Kristol and his ideas. He was rather supportive of the Trump administration bombing Iran. And a lot of people that are watching the bulwark might be more critical of the Trump administration. So that kind of frustrated them. You can see it in the comment sections. So even though Bush was gone, Kristol still has a platform and is still pretty controversial. But this idea of an assertive American engagement, of confronting dictators and of backing democratic opposition abroad did not simply disappear. These ideas remained part of the broader foreign policy debate, waiting for new contexts in which they might resurface. These ideas of engagement with the rest of the world, even as, say, the Trump administration ran on a America First, hands off the rest of the world approach. And so that does bring us to Donald Trump. And at first glance, Trump and Kristol are polar opposites. Kristol oftentimes speaks out against the Trump administration. And when we think of what Trump campaigned on, he campaigned on rejecting the very language of democracy promotion that neoconservatives like Bill Kristol would talk and write about. Trump spoke out against what he called endless wars. When his voters were polled, why do you support Donald Trump? Many people in these polls, in these polls or in these focus groups, would say that Trump's against endless wars, and so that was a selling point for Donald Trump. His foreign policy slogan, "America First," emphasized nationalism, skepticism of alliances, and a transactional approach to international affairs. Trump often suggested that America should stay out of other countries' problems unless there was a clear payoff for the U.S. So Kristol, for his part, became one of Trump's fiercest critics, as I mentioned. He argued that Trump was abandoning America's role as a leader of the free world, and that his approach would allow dictators to feel more emboldened. And if the U.S. wasn't going to confront them, their threat of these dictatorships would grow. So if we look just at the surface, you might think that there's no way to connect Bill Kristol's neoconservative ideas with contemporary foreign policy from Donald Trump. And yet, if we look a little closer and we look at the Venezuela foreign policy of the U.S. as an example, we do see some surprising parallels. So this dates back to Trump's first term. So when we think back to even 2017, the Trump administration has turned its attention to Venezuela under the emerging autocrat Nicolas Maduro. Venezuela had once been one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, but by the late 2010s, it has been mirrored in political repression, economic collapse, and a humanitarian disaster. Maduro, who succeeded Hugo Chavez, has consolidated power through authoritarian tactics like crackdown on opposition parties and presided over a pretty devastating decline in living standards. So the Trump administration has responded and did respond with a set of measures that looked very similar to anyone who studied neoconservative approaches to foreign policy. The U.S. imposed sweeping sanctions on the Maduro regime, targeting Venezuela's oil sector and freezing Venezuela assets abroad. The U.S. went even further by recognizing the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president of Venezuela, which basically declared Maduro's role illegitimate in the role of Washington. So Trump has officially Trump officials, have repeatedly suggested that all options are on the table, a phrase widely understood to include the possibility of military intervention, which I know the government shutdown in the U.S. is front and center in the Washington Post and the New York Times today. But if you scroll down some, you will find articles talking about the U.S.'s maybe growing intervention into Venezuela. So when we think of more recently, Trump has endorsed the use of force at sea to interdict ships suspected of carrying materials to or from Maduro's government. The Trump administration saying they're drug paraphernalia. And so the U.S. naval forces have acted against this maritime traffic linked to Venezuela, signaling a willingness to use some, at least limited for now, military power as part of a pressure campaign against the Venezuelan government. Trump himself has spoken rather forcefully against Maduro, calling him a dictator and insisting that the U.S. will do what needs to be done to restore democracy in Venezuela. So now we can compare all of that to Kristol's worldview. Kristol argued for confronting dictators, isolating them diplomatically, backing their domestic opposition, and using American power, economic, political, and military to force change. This is pretty remarkably similar to the toolkit Trump deployed against Venezuela and is currently deploying against Venezuela. Sanctions, diplomatic recognition of the opposition, military signaling, and sharp rhetoric about tyranny. These are straight from neoconservative playbooks. So when we think about what is going on here, how can Trump, who rejected neoconservatism, end up sounding a lot like neocons when it comes to Venezuela? So this answer might lie in motivation. For Kristol and the neoconservatives, international intervention abroad was about more than just a specific dictator or a single crisis. It was about reshaping the world in America's image, promoting democracy as a universal mission, and building a global order led by the United States. Their motivations were rooted in ideology and a long-term vision of international politics. For Trump, we can compare that. The motivations seem to be narrower and more transactional. His administration's stance on Venezuela has been influenced by maybe domestic political considerations, particularly the importance of Venezuelan Americans and Cuban American voters in Florida. Taking a hard line against Maduro has fit neatly into Trump's anti-socialist rhetoric and helped him appeal to key constituencies that are now key to his grouping of constituencies, as well as the Republican Party. Moreover, his use of sanctions and naval actions have allowed him to project toughness without committing U.S. ground troops or engaging in costly nation building, which when we look at public polling, it is very unpopular to get involved in international military intervention. So while the tactics might look the same, sanctions, delegitimization, opposition support, even some military coercion, the strategic logic is quite different. Kristol used these tools in service of a broad, idealistic mission. Trump used them as instruments instruments of transactional politics and limited strategic signaling. So the contrast is revealing. It shows how the same foreign policy tools that might look the same and maybe have some similarities can be put to very different purposes depending on who is in power. Neoconservatives saw them as part of a global strategy to expand democracy. Trump seems to see them as levers to pressure an adversary, score political points at home, and maybe even reinforce his America First brand. So I did want to just talk about how there is some overlap between Bill Kristol and these neoconservative ideas, which have rooted themselves in American foreign policy, but maybe what the goals are, the objectives are for the Trump administration are quite different. So thank you.